The notification came at 11:47 on a Sunday night, and I almost didn't check it. I'd just gotten home from my aunt's place in Barrie. 4 hours of highway driving, my back stiff, my eyes tired from the glare of the 400. It had been a long weekend. My grandmother's 80th birthday, the whole family crammed into my aunt's backyard with paper plates and citronella candles, and that same potato salad my uncle makes every single year. The kind of gathering where someone always cries, and someone always says something they shouldn't, and by the end of it everyone hugs like they mean it, even though half of them don't. I was standing in my kitchen in Mississauga, still in my jacket, filling a glass of water, when my phone buzzed on the counter. TD Bank, unusual activity on your account. Please review your recent transactions. I remember setting the glass down very slowly. The balance when I opened the app was $214. 3 days before, it had been $47,800. I stood there for a long time. Long enough that the kitchen light clicked off on its timer and I was standing in the dark with my phone screen the only light in the room. I kept pulling down to refresh, like the number was going to change, like I had misread it, like there was some version of this that made sense. There wasn't. I'm going to tell you something that might make you uncomfortable. When I finally called the fraud line that night and started walking through the transactions with the rep, a woman with a kind, steady voice who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, I wasn't crying, I wasn't screaming, I was very, very calm. The kind of calm that I've since learned is just shock wearing a mask. The transactions had gone through over 2 days. Friday afternoon, while I was on the road heading north, and Saturday morning, while I was helping my grandmother blow out her candles. Transfers. E-transfers, actually. To an account I didn't recognize. 8 of them, just under the daily limit each time, spread out carefully so they wouldn't immediately trigger a flag. Someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who knew the limits. Someone who had my login information. I need to back up, because you're not going to understand what happened next unless you understand what came before. I grew up in Brampton. My parents divorced when I was 9, and I ended up living mostly with my mother and my father rotating in and out, depending on his work schedule and his moods. He was a charming man, my father. The kind of person who walks into a room and everyone turns to look. He had stories for every occasion and a laugh that made you want to laugh too, and for a long time, when I was young, I thought that meant he was a good person. I learned the difference slowly. By the time I was in university, Ryerson, now TMU, studying accounting, I understood that my father was someone who borrowed money the way other people borrowed pens. Casually. Without real intention of returning it. Not always in dramatic ways. Sometimes it was $100 here, a tank of gas there. Once it was the rent money I'd set aside for my first apartment, which he'd accessed from a joint account we still shared from it when I was a teenager. That one hurt. I was 22. I had to call my mother and ask to come home, and the conversation with her about why was one of the hardest of my life, because she'd warned me. She'd warned me about him for years and I'd defended him, and now I was sitting on the floor of a half-empty apartment telling her she was right. I thought I'd learned my lesson. The thing about people like my father is that they don't change, but they do get better at waiting. He gave me years. Actual years of being a decent father, calling on birthdays, showing up to things, being present in the way I'd always wanted him to be. He met my boyfriend. He came to my work Christmas party once and charmed everyone there. My guard came down so gradually I didn't even notice it happening. That's the thing they never tell you. It's not one moment of trust. It's 1,000 small moments, stacked up like sandbags, and to the time you realize the river is rising, it's already too late. 2 months before my grandmother's birthday, my father called me. He said he was having trouble with his phone's banking app and could I help him set it up when I was next in town. Sure, I said. Of course. I was going to be in Brampton the following weekend for a friend's birthday, and I swung by his place on the Saturday afternoon. His laptop was old, slow. He had a browser with 17 tabs open and I had to wait 3 minutes for the page to load. I logged into my own account briefly, to check a transaction he said he'd sent me. He claimed he'd finally paid me back $100 from the fall, and then I walked him through setting up the TD app on his phone. It took maybe 45 minutes. I closed the browser when I was done, or I thought I did. I thought about that afternoon for a long time after the night of the notification. I thought about whether I'd actually closed the tab, whether the browser had a saved password, whether he'd watched me type it, whether it mattered which one, because the result was the same. The result was $47,800 missing from my account. My savings. Almost 4 years of careful, deliberate saving, because I work as a junior tax accountant and the money doesn't come fast and I am very aware of that, so I had always been disciplined. That account was my down payment fund. The thing I had been building toward, the way you build toward something, when you're 31, and living in one of the most expensive cities in the country, and a house feels like a myth someone made up to sell you something. It was gone. I spent the rest of that night on the phone with the bank. I filed an official dispute. I submitted a fraud report. The rep walked me through every step with the kind of patience that made me want to cry, and I didn't. Not then. She told me an investigation would be opened and that I should also file a police report, given the nature of the transactions. I said I would. I thanked her. Then I sat on my couch at 3 a.m. and stared at the wall and thought about whether I actually knew, in my gut, who had done this. I did. I had known since the moment I saw the balance. I just hadn't wanted it to be true. I called my father the next morning. It was a Monday. I had to go into work in 3 hours. I called him at 8 a.m. and he picked up on the second ring, sounding perfectly normal, perfectly awake, and I asked him if he knew anything about my bank account. There was a pause. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. But I know his voice and I know his pauses, and that one told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. What do you mean? He said. I mean my savings account, I said. $47,000. It's gone. Another pause. Then, are you sure? Sometimes these apps have glitches. I don't know what I expected. Denial, probably. The usual. I had not expected what came next, which was nothing at all, because I heard him cover the phone with his hand, and I heard, very faintly, the sound of my stepmother's voice on the other end, and then he came back and said, "Look, I needed to borrow it. We'll pay it back. We needed it more right now." I think that sentence is going to live in my head for the rest of my life. We needed it more. Not a question. Not an apology. A statement of justification, delivered the way you'd explain why you ate the last of the leftovers. We needed it more. As if need was a unit of measurement. And they had simply measured more of it than I did. As if the fact that I had saved that money, had sacrificed trips and new furniture, and 100 small pleasures for 4 years to save that money, meant nothing compared to whatever they had decided they required it for. I said, "Okay," very quietly. He said, "I knew you'd understand. You've always been the responsible one." And I said, "Yeah, you should be home this week." Then I hung up and I called my mother. She didn't say "I told you so." She's not that kind of person. She just breathed for a moment and then she said, "What do you need?" And I told her I needed a lawyer. Here is what you should know about me. I am an accountant. I am not a dramatic person. I do not make large gestures or grand speeches. What I do, when something goes wrong, is I sit down and I look at the numbers, and I figure out what is actually possible. That is what I did. I filed the police report that Monday. The officer at 22 Division in Peels was thorough and kind, and explained to me that fraud between family members is complicated but absolutely prosecutable, and that the e-transfer trail would be significant evidence. I had the transaction records. I had the dates and times, which overlapped directly with my father's location and device activity. The bank's fraud investigation moved faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, they had confirmed the access had originated from a device registered to my father's home IP address. My lawyer, who I found through a colleague's referral, and who I will also be grateful to for the rest of my life, told me I had a strong case, civil and potentially criminal. She explained the difference between the two tracks and what each would involve, and what I could realistically expect. She was honest with me. She said the criminal process would be slower and the outcome uncertain. She said the civil route would likely result in a judgment faster, and that we could pursue enforcement through wage garnishment or property lien. My father owned a house in Brampton. He'd bought it with my stepmother 15 years ago. It was worth considerably more now than it had been then. My lawyer was very clear about what a lien would mean. I said, "Let's do both." The thing I want to say about the weeks that followed is that they were very quiet. I went to work. I ate dinner. I called my mother on Wednesdays and my grandmother on Sundays. I did not call my father. I did not answer when he called me, which he did twice. Once to tell me I was overreacting, and once to leave a voicemail that started with, "I know you're upset at," and ended with him explaining that he'd had some investment opportunities that hadn't worked out, and he'd planned to pay me back within 6 months. 6 months. I listened to that voicemail once, and then I forwarded it to my lawyer. She loved it. My stepmother texted me 3 weeks after the initial incident. She said she hadn't known the full amount, that my father had told her he'd borrowed some money from me with my permission, and that she was sorry if there had been a misunderstanding. I read it several times. I found it interesting that she used the word misunderstanding. I did not respond. My father's brother, my uncle, who I have always liked and who has always been straight with me, called me separately. He'd heard something was going on. I told him, factually and without drama, exactly what had happened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry, kid, he's done this to people before." He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask him to. The civil judgment came through faster than I expected. 14 weeks after I filed, the judge was not particularly interested in my father's explanation, which had evolved by then into a story about a verbal agreement and a misunderstanding and intentions to repay. The transaction records didn't support a verbal agreement. The way the transfers had been structured, just under the daily limit, spread across 2 days, did not support a spontaneous decision. It supported planning. My father was ordered to repay the full $47,800 plus legal costs and interest. The enforcement mechanism, given his liquid assets were limited, was a lien on the Brampton property. He called me the night after the judgment. I picked up this time because I had decided I wanted to hear it. He said I had destroyed the family. He said I was vindictive. He said that after everything he had done for me, this was how I repaid him. I let him finish. Then I said, "You took 4 years of my savings. You planned it. You did it while I was sitting at Gran's birthday party. I loved you, and you did it anyway." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You'll regret this." I said, "I really don't think I will," and I hung up. The house sold 18 months later. In that market, even with the lien, they walked away with something. My father relocated to Hamilton. My stepmother sent me a letter that I did not read past the second paragraph. I don't know the details of what happened between the two of them, and I genuinely don't need to. The money came through on a Tuesday in November. It arrived in the account I'd opened the week after the fraud, the account that only I had access to, protected by two-factor authentication, and a security word I chose specifically, because it was something my father would never guess. It came in as a certified payment, processed through the enforcement office. I sat in my car in the parking lot at work and looked at the balance for a long time. That afternoon I went to see my mortgage broker. The appointment had been on hold for almost 2 years. She pulled up my file, looked at the updated numbers and said, "Okay, let's talk about what you can actually afford." I bought a condo in Mississauga the following spring. 13th floor. Southwest facing. On a clear day you can see the lake. My uncle came to help me move. He brought coffee in a truck he borrowed from someone at work and didn't ask any questions I didn't want to answer. My best friend, who I've known since high school in Brampton and who drove from Oakville with a carload of boxes and a bottle of wine we drank sitting on the floor cause I didn't have a couch yet, helped me carry things up in the elevator for 3 hours, and then ordered pizza and sat with me while I looked out at the city. "You okay?" she asked. I thought about it. Actually thought about it, because she deserved a real answer and not a reflexive one. "Yeah," I said. "I actually am. Here is the thing about growing up with a parent like my father. You spend a lot of time waiting for the other shoe. You get good at reading rooms and keeping track of what you've said and who might have heard it. You learn to keep certain things close and certain feelings quiet. You become, without meaning to, someone who is very good at managing what other people think of them, while quietly managing everything else underneath. It's exhausting. And it's so normal when you're inside it that you don't know it's exhausting until you're out. I'm out now. I still talk to my grandmother every Sunday. She never asks about my father directly, but sometimes she says, 'I'm glad you're doing well,' in a way that tells me she knows more than she lets on. She turned 82 last summer. I drove up to Barrie with flowers and a lemon cake from the Portuguese bakery on my street, and we sat in her garden for 3 hours, and she told me stories about her own life that I had never heard before, about the things she had survived, about the choices she had made. She's a practical woman, my grandmother. She said to me before I left, "The hardest part isn't the betrayal. The hardest part is deciding you're still allowed to be happy after." I thought about that for most of the drive home down the 400, the sun going down behind me over Georgian Bay, the city getting closer through the windshield. I decided she was right. I am still allowed to be happy. I decided that on a Tuesday in November, when the money hit a new account my father didn't know existed, in a name he couldn't touch, protected by a password he would never guess. I decided it again the day I signed the papers on my condo, and I decided it one more time on a cold March evening when I stood in an empty apartment on the 13th floor, and watched the lights come on over the city and the lake and thought, "This is mine. Every square foot of it. No one is going to take it from me, not this time."